So I like to think that that you come to the boot camp and you take it as what it is, that it is just a boot camp. It is that one place where you can sharpen your knife, but you need to use your tool the rest of the week. And I like to think that you have a practice where you spend at least 15 minutes a day for yourself, for your own mental and spiritual health. Now, on the other hand, I don't recommend that you wake up in the morning and you just sit 15 minutes because your mind is not awake yet. And you actually need energy to allow you to focus and not let your mind wander away, okay? So I think, let's stop for a minute. Let me see. Muhammad had a very good comment, and he said that this is a meditation technique that seeks to train the mind to focus your attention and to redirect thoughts. And then that's a very good summary of what we're trying to do here. Is that, and it's just that we all use different language. I use the word anchoring, as if we're in the middle of a storm, which we are. Very dark storm right now. Just the beginning, even not even the beginning of the beginning. And it's just very scary thinking what's going to happen in the days to come. But in any case, it's a storm, and you are just this tiny little vehicle, this little vessel, and the only way you can ride through the storm and not be consumed by it is if you can throw an anchor. And the anchor is what we call mindfulness. So that's what Muhammad said, is that it's a technique. It's not just an exercise. It's exercise for the body, but it's exercise for the mind, where you could learn to focus, learn to anchor. Now, then when you say change your thought, meaning that at least you understand your thoughts. And this is the part where the meditation is important, because that 15 minutes that you spend is not just your own oasis. It's not just your own sanctuary where you can stay away from that craziness, but it actually trains your body and your breath so that you're becoming more sensitive to it. And so the next time when you have a thought that you know is not good for you, what we call unskillful thoughts, akusala thoughts, hate, anger, division, all that, then you say, hey, they control everything else right now. For the first time in the history of a republic, you have one group of people controlling all our branches, including the media, but at least they cannot control my emotion. At least let me have the choice. This is the topic today, is the freedom of choice. At least I can choose what kind of thoughts I have. And I choose not to be angry. I choose not to hate. I choose not to fear. But how do you choose? How do you know? Well, that's the word emotional intelligence comes in. Intelligence can mean intelligence agent. Intelligent agent are like the canary in the cave. They sense it before you do. And so after some practice and meditation, your body becomes very sensitive, your breath becomes sensitive. And before you know it, you say, hey, what's going on? Oh, I better not do that. Let it go. Let it go. Don't jump into that fire anger, because it will consume you. All right, so in the past 2 months or so, at the end of the class, I do a Dharma talk. And this week, I feel like I shouldn't be doing Dharma talks. This is too crazy a week. Maybe we should just take a rest. Then I read something posted by a student on Facebook. Hey, it's easy to hate DEI, but tell me, which part do you hate? Is it diversity, equity, or inclusion that you hate? And it turns out that it's very difficult to hate DEI if you actually spell out the content. That was very inspiring. And I decided that, well, maybe I should do a Dharma talk after all. Maybe I should talk about DEI from my perspective, from the perspective of an immigrant. The problem with DEI is that in this last election, it became a wedge issue. We lost the fight because we allowed it to be a wedge issue. It was our fault, because we were fighting for the right issue, but we fought it in the wrong battleground. Most of the country right now is a lot less concerned about diversity, equity, and inclusion because they're much more focused on their everyday living. I'm 69, as I mentioned. I was here when I was 15 years old. I became a naturalized citizen when I was 20. So I've been a citizen now for 40, almost 50 years. Almost 50 years. And I've seen this country. And my life as an American is a life of DEI. I've seen it. I benefit from it. I fought for it. I was thinking about this morning. It wasn't in my original script. And I was thinking about it. When I traveled to Japan, you know, people go to Japan because of the sushi. But you know what? You can only get sushi at the coastal towns. And you get plenty of it. It's very cheap because they have no refrigeration. They have no way of transporting them on a refrigerated truck, or it's very expensive. So it's very cheap. If you don't eat it, they go rotten, and there's nothing to do with that. So it's very cheap. It's amazingly cheap. But then when you go in the mountain, they don't have it anymore. And if they have it, it's very expensive. It becomes a delicacy. And you have to be a connoisseur to really enjoy that delicacy. DEI has become a delicacy. And you have to be a connoisseur to afford to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, because most of the people are not working class anymore. They're the working poor. So let me talk about DEI as a perspective, from a perspective of an immigrant. So these days, immigrant is a very complicated issue. It's very complicated because we're trying to simplify it. We're lumping everything into immigrant. That's why it's complicated. If you want to simplify immigration in America, you have to separate it first into what is legal and what is illegal. And you cannot call someone who entered this country illegally an immigrant, because immigrant by definition has to be legal. And that's the biggest mistake we made, is by calling someone who's illegal undocumented, by trying to say that they have a right to be here. They have no right to be here. I have no right to be here. And I'll explain that in a minute. So first you have to separate it. If you're going to talk about immigrant, it has to be legal. And if you're going to talk about something that's illegal, then it's illegal. It's criminal, whether they're immigrant or migrant or whatever. If you enter this country illegally, you are a criminal. One of the issues that we talk about is something called natural-born citizenship. The idea is that if you were born in this country, then you have the right. That right comes from the Latin word called jus soli, right of the soil. Those who were born here, even if their parents were not citizens, they would be given the right to be a citizen. That birthright citizenship is guaranteed by a constitution in the 14th Amendment. But it's not always so. In 1898, there was actually a Supreme Court case involving a Chinese person by the name of Wong Kim Ark. He's very famous among the Chinese. He was born here. His parents were immigrant, legal immigrant. He left the United States to visit his parents' family in China, and when he came back, he was denied entry. He was denied entry because he didn't have the right to be a citizen because of his parents were not citizens and because he was Chinese. So he took it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided, reaffirmed his right as a natural-born citizen, and reaffirmed that that right is irrespective of the race and irrespective of the status of the parents. And why was he denied re-entry? Because a few years earlier, the US government, the federal government, have passed a law called the Exclusion Act. The Exclusion Act was tailored only to the Chinese, no one else. And it says that no more, from this day on, No Chinese person can enter this country. Not only that, those who are already here, they can never be a citizen. Everybody else can, but not the Chinese. Not only that, even if you were born here and you were a natural born citizen, you cannot travel unless you're given a special permission. That was just for the Chinese. Now, last week, I talked a great deal about Japan, right? Wow, Japanese. Japan is such a great country. Then you go there all the time. He enjoys the food, enjoys the culture. Such a beautiful place. It's like I wish it would be like this. Well, except that I didn't have time to talk about the negative side of the Japanese society. And since I'm talking about immigration, let me talk about how the Japanese treats their citizens. Now, I don't know how many of you know the history, but Korea was under Japanese occupation for many years, for almost, I believe, more than 100. I don't know if it was 200. And during the time, because it was important, they had a lot of minerals, just like we're going after the mineral in Ukraine, right? Because, needed for war. And so they occupied Korea for the mineral, for everything. And when they started invading the Chinese, they actually started to import labor from Korea into Japan to help with their weaponry. And so before and during World War II, about 700,000 to 800,000 Koreans, mostly men, were forced migrate into Japan and become more or less slave labor. By the end of the war, when Japanese government surrendered, there were 2 million Koreans living in Japan, which is a large number. So after the war, the Japanese government deported them back to Korea. But some of them stayed. Some of them decided to stay in Japan. But they were never given Japanese citizenship. Even today, if you were a Korean living in Japan, even if you were born here, even if your parents were born here, you are never given Korean citizenship. You actually have to register as a foreigner with all the prejudices, with all the things. So in other words, Japan never have birthright citizenship. They don't have DEI. The concept of diversity, inclusion, and equity doesn't make sense for them. Racism, ageism, misogyny, discriminate based on both either physical or mental disability. Disability based on sexual preference, sexual identity, are no normal behavior in Japan, all in the name of maintaining harmony in this very monolithic society. So we are trying to be like them. We're trying to be like them. On the other hand, as an immigrant, since I was 15 years old, as a naturalized citizen since I was 20, and as a contributing entrepreneur and academic for so many years, helping to be a productive member of society, I can tell you with no uncertainties that DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is what makes this country great. Let me talk a little bit about immigration policy in the United States, because it's very unique. Many of you might not know that, have no need to know that. Immigration is not a right. Immigration is a right only to its citizen. If you are an American citizen and you have family, whether it is your parents, your siblings, or your children living in Mexico or wherever, you have the right as a citizen to be united with your family. So you would apply for reunification and they would wait to turn. They could wait 10 years. We waited a long time. Immigration was never a right for the immigrant. The United States has always had an open door policy to welcome immigrants as long as they are legal. So now it explains why so many Hispanic would vote the other side, because we confuse immigrant with the so-called immigration policy, which is really more about how to deal with illegal alien. The people who are here, like myself, we enter legally. And to say that we will allow people who enter illegally, the people who don't have to wait 10, 15 years for the turn to have that right, is wrong. But on the other hand, it is that immigration policy, the strength and the robustness. It is that idea that we welcome diversity, that we give equal access to opportunity to those who are different from us. That makes what this country great. So in the beginning of the talk, I said DEI was the right battle. We fought it in the wrong battleground, and we lost. Let me explain what that means. Many of you know Thich Nhat Hanh, a very famous Vietnamese monk who passed away a few years back, who taught mindfulness meditation, who taught engaged Buddhism. How many of you know that he had made important contributions to the United States during the Vietnam War era? Many of you might not. Many of you remember Martin Luther King, of course. He fought for the rights of the minority, fought for the rights of the colored people of color. But it was Thich Nhat Hanh who talks about the Vietnam War and turned Dr. King into a national leader. In 1965, Dr. King received a very long letter from Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh entitled "In Search of the Enemy of Man." Now you have to understand the background. 2 years before he wrote that letter, 2 years before he wrote the letter was 1963. I was 7 years old, and I remember they didn't have television yet. I remember the newspaper talks about this monk in Vietnam that sat in the middle of the street in the cross section, and his disciple poured gasoline on him and lit a fire, and he burned himself to death. It was a protest. It was a protest to the oppressive regime that we were supporting. And within the next 2 months, 5 more monks set them on fire. And it was in this context that Thich Nhat Hanh wrote to Dr. King. And in the letter he says, "I believe with all my heart that the monks who burned themselves to death did not aim at the death of their oppressor. Their enemies were not men. Their enemies were intolerance, fanaticism, dictatorship, greed, hatred, discrimination in the heart of man." In other words, when you fight a war, don't fight it on policy. Fight for what the country stands for. So Dr. King understood that, and he carries that fight not just to the black people, but to all people, black and white, because it was the right thing to do. It wasn't about policy, it was about what the country stands for. And Dr. King became a voice of our collective consciousness, fighting for injustice for all people. So here I said, the Rainbow Coalition that he built was not just for the colored people, it was for all people, including the white. And I said something like, there's no color in rainbow without white. You have to understand that. You cannot build a rainbow just on the color. You have to include white. White is a very important color in the rainbow. In this coming years, in the coming years, we must learn from Dr. King. We must continue to fight for DI. I fought it for 50 years. But we must fight it in the right battle. We cannot make it into just about those who need it. We must make it into all of us who wants it. That this is about the character of us, not about individual. We cannot just make it into a delicacy and turn ourselves into connoisseur. So where is the battlefield? Where is the battlefield for diversity, equity, and inclusion? The biggest problem we face today in our society is wealth discrepancy. In 2021, this is like 4 years ago, the statistic was that 1% of the household in America held 31% of the wealth. The bottom 50% owns only 2.6%. That's the difference. Of all the wealth in this country, personal wealth I'm talking about, 35% came from inheritance. In other words, if your parents are wealthy, you will be wealthy. If your parents are not, then you're going to have to work for living wages. Let's fight DEI not as a social issue. Let's fight it as an economic issue. We need to fight it to address the inequality of all people in America. We must take the fight to all of the people. We must not make the mistake of letting it be a wedge issue. Our enemy is not policy. Our enemy is intolerance, greed, hatred, division, and discrimination. Don't change the fight. Change the battlefield.